What's up, guys? Today we're going to be taking an in-depth look at a guitar from Gibson's newest line of reissues, the Murphy Lab. Specifically, I've got this guitar. It is a Murphy Lab heavy-aged RO or 1960 reissue Les Paul. This was lent to me by my friend Daniel. He's got a ridiculous guitar collection. Check him out on Instagram, give him a follow. I've got it linked in the description. Okay, so this video, we're going to go over the good, the bad, and what I consider the in-between in an honest review from a user's perspective. I'm obviously not a store that's trying to sell you the guitar. This is not a demo, this is a review. So yeah, I'm just gonna give it to you guys straight. In addition, I thought it might be fun to compare the guitar to what I consider the best Les Paul I've ever played. And that is this Goldtop behind me. It is a made-to-measure aged R7 from 2018. So we'll do some side-by-side demos of the two. I'll play through a bunch of different amps, different playing styles, and yeah, we'll just compare them side by side. In addition, they're both aged, as I said, and they use very different aging processes for these two guitars. So we'll compare them and kind of go over the new style that is on the Murphy Lab. Okay, without further ado, give that subscribe button a tap and let's get into it. So first and foremost, I know some of you might want to get straight to the playing or you really want to look at the aging differences. I've gone ahead and added timestamps in the video and the description, so feel free to jump ahead to whatever section you are most interested in. So let's go over, first and foremost, kind of just a brief history of what Murphy Labs is, since it's brand new. And I see a lot of confusion online, so let's go over it really quickly. Tom Murphy is a man that's worked for Gibson Custom Shop for decades, as I understand it. He really made a name for himself with his really, above and beyond skills with painting bursts on Les Pauls, in addition to eventually kind of his finish aging. He really became known as like the guy for finish aging at Gibson. So any guitar from Gibson with his name tied to it usually carries a really hefty premium, both used and new. And yeah, people pay a lot of money to have Tom Murphy paint or age their guitars. So fast forward to March of 2021, Gibson announces the brand new Murphy Lab. So this is an addition to the Gibson Custom Shop. So it's a division within Custom Shop for those that want a relic instrument beyond the VOS finish option that most of them come with. So it is important to note that Tom Murphy is not actually aging these Murphy Lab guitars. There's no reason to believe he is part of any of the physical processes at all. Instead, it seems like he is overseeing the operation with what I presume to be like a small trained team that's under the Custom Shop umbrella. So you can still get a Tom Murphy aged and finished guitar. You can still order that, but it would be through the Made to Measure program, which Gibson offers. It's kind of like the custom shop of the custom shop. So this is a Made to Measure guitar. It just allows you to spec things out and get something a little different or more unique. So let's cover really quick the difference between VOS and Murphy Lab. So VOS, the differences are pretty simple. VOS finishes have no lacquer checking. They have no dings, no impressions on the finish, no finish is missing anywhere. But they do have aged or tarnished hardware. And the finish itself, I would describe as kind of slightly hazy. It's not buffed to like a perfect shine like you would see on like a PRS, for example. So it just looks older. So that's VOS. Murphy Labs is very different. So to quote Tom Murphy from the announcement video Gibson posted back in March, Murphy Labs is the future of aging a Gibson guitar. And so from what I can gather, they developed a new nitro lacquer formula specifically for this range of guitars. And that aids in the aging process because it's extra brittle. So I haven't seen this outright confirmed yet, but it seems that Gibson is aging these guitars by subjecting them to a series of rapid temperature changes. So hot to cold, or vice versa. And that basically creates the cracking or checking because the wood is expanding and contracting, with the temperature changes, but the finish is hard and brittle. It can't move with the wood, so it just ends up checking instead. Now, checking is present on all Murphy Lab guitars. So as you go up in aging levels, you've got ultralight to heavy to ultra heavy. You don't get more or less checking. That's not really how it works. Instead, as you go up in age, in those age tiers, you get more like body dings, buckle rash, finish wear, through to the wood, things like that. So the next question is, how does this aging compare to the aging Gibson did on their guitars prior to the Murphy Labs? So that would be their made to measure or their special run guitars such as Collector's Choice. Well, let's take a look at how they differ side by side. First and foremost, the process for getting the checking previous to Murphy Labs was actually by using a razor blade to hand carve lines into the finish of the entire guitar. I've got to be honest, I can't even imagine the amount of work and man hours that takes to do and the skill required. And that's not even taking into consideration the pressure, because if you're trying to draw a line and you mess up just slightly, there's no taking it back. There's no like redo. The guitar is going to have to be completely refinished. So I'm not surprised at all that Gibson moved to the temperature method, regardless of how you feel about the look or its, vintage accuracy or whatever. It's got to be infinitely more economically viable and just much easier for a production line instrument, which this is. If you're going to be making thousands and thousands of guitars, you can't have people, meticulously carving lines with the razor blade. Just not going to work. So right off the bat, just kind of feeling the two guitars, you can tell the Murphy's lacquer has a slightly different feel to it. It's almost more slick, I would describe it. It's hard to describe, but immediately noticed when I picked it up, it was different. Now, due to the nature of the processes used, the made-to-measure checking is super consistent across the guitar on all sides. It's basically all vertical checking, not horizontal. The Murphy, on the other hand, is super sporadic. Some spots I think look great, particularly where the checking is larger, but then other spots I think look a little odd to me, almost like shattered glass in parts. Now, it's super important to note that actual vintage checking is highly inconsistent, and that's across multiple different guitars. They look different. Now, I'm going to put up some examples of what I mean from an amazing photographer, Eleanor Jane. I've got her linked in the description. Definitely give her a follow on Instagram. She is an amazing photographer, shoots for guitar.com, Guitar Magazine. She was gracious enough to let me use a couple photos to show you guys as examples. So you notice some of these vintage Gibsons feature nearly all vertical checking with just kind of little random loops here and there. You'll get examples with very tight, straight vertical lines across the finish. And then you get other ones where it's much more sparse and maybe the vertical checking is pretty wavy. It really just varies. Then you'll have some guitars with the same thing, except for instead of vertical, they're horizontal lines. I've seen this really most often on ES type guitars, but it'll happen on solid body guitars as well. Then you'll also see extremely sporadic checking where it goes in all directions, vertical and horizontal. Those usually accompany heavily worn and aged vintage guitars. Again, the checking can be relatively large or it can be really small and fine. Finally, there are also plenty of vintage guitars with little to no checking. My 63 Junior, for example, has very little apart from a couple specific little spots. So all of that to say, whatever you're using as your benchmark for what authentic, checking should look like, just know there's probably a contradictory vintage guitar example out there that is completely different. Now, when it comes to these guitars and their age finishes, much like a preference for a certain color, for example, I think you'll probably have a preference between the razor blade vertical look versus what's coming out of the Murphy Lab. I think both are valid. As always, your mileage may vary, and I definitely don't think it's black and white on which is better or more vintage accurate looking. For me though, actually as well as the owner of this guitar, we both prefer the checking look from the razor blade method on the made to measure overall. I wish it was slightly more randomized in the spacing and the line angles, but to be honest, I genuinely look at that finish more like a piece of art than anything else. Again, the amazing amount of skill required to achieve the results that guitar has, it's hard to fathom for me. As for feel, you can actually really feel the checking on the Murphy Lab. The top of the guitar, you don't feel it that much, but in some spots you can feel it when you're running your nails across it. The made to measure, you can't feel the checking really at all. Vintage guitars I played, you can't feel the checking either unless there is like humidity damage. But if you go over to the back of the Murphy Lab, you can actually really feel the checking. You can definitely feel the lines with your nails, some spots more than others. But then you have certain areas such as right here, kind of where the strap button is, or this heel where you can definitely feel it. And you can actually visually see the finish raise slightly in places. The rest of the aging, like the various dings and whatnot, I think looks pretty good. Apart from what I'm going to dub the birdshot look some seem to have. This one has it right here. This one isn't too bad, but to me it can look a little goofy. I've seen it, a lot of them have a ton of these little, again, it looks like it got shot by a shotgun, but your mileage may vary. Not a huge fan of that, but this one doesn't look bad. I also think that the edge wear here looks really good. The transition is nice and smooth between the wood and the lacquer. If we go over to the back here, you've got this little buckle rash area. The transition from lacquer to wood is a little bit more steep back here. You can kind of feel it a little bit more. It seems like the lacquer on the back is a little bit thicker. And then moving over to the neck right here, it does have some edge wear there, and honestly, it feels pretty good. You don't really notice the change while playing it, going from lacquer to bare wood. All right, that covers the looks. Now let's move over to the tone. So let's listen to some excerpts of me playing the Murphy Lab side by side with the Goldtop here. And that guitar is fitted with dual coil PF humbuckers. I've done a few videos on these pickups. I will link in the description or put it up in the corner so you can check that out if you're curious. We're gonna play through a variety of different amps and play styles to kind of get a nice holistic view of the tones from these guitars. All right, let's see how they sound. Well, I don't know about you guys, but I found that really fascinating. As I mentioned at the top of this video, I consider my Goldtop to be the gold standard, pun intended, for Les Pauls. It's the best sounding one I've ever played, particularly after I did the pickup swap. So immediately when placed side by side with this guitar, you really notice the Murphy. It leans more to the warmer side of the PAF coin, particularly on the neck with its extra low mids and bass. The bridge, on the other hand, on the Murphy, it felt a little imbalanced, I would say. It's a good bit thinner and quieter sounding than the neck, which made it a little tricky to use in practice. I actually had a very similar issue with that Goldtop and the stock custom buckers it came with. No matter how low I made the neck or how high I made the bridge, I couldn't get them to balance their output evenly. Also, if you ever try to set up a tone for a guitar that's darker and set it up for the neck pickup, then you have to roll back the bridge tone to kind of keep it from being super shrill. Well, because these have 50s wiring, when you roll back the tone, you're actually dropping the output a little bit. And so it just exacerbates the issue where the neck is just always going to be much louder than the bridge. This one I don't think goes quite as bad as that was with the stock custom buckers, but it's a pattern I've noticed with those pickups. Now let's be clear, I don't think this guitar sounds bad. It's definitely got a softer sound to it. It's quite a bit less microphonic despite not being wax potted, and has less high end. So if you're sensitive to that sort of thing, the darker tone might be right up your alley. Total personal preference thing. What I will say, however, is that having a brighter guitar as a starting point is, in my opinion, almost always preferable because it's much easier to take top end off than it is to add clarity in that wasn't there already. Particularly since, these guitars have tone controls for both pickups, you can always roll back the tone a little bit. It is also worth noting I did struggle a little bit setting up the amp tones for this comparison because these two guitars sounded so different in the room. If I EQ'd the amp for the Murphy, for example, the Goldtop would sound a bit harsh. And if I EQ'd like I normally would for the Goldtop, the Murphy would come across very dark and muddy. I did my very best to find a happy medium, and I did alternate between each guitar when I was setting up the tones so that I didn't heavily favor one over the other. I try to keep it fair, but just keep that in mind. All right, with the tone covered, let's finish out the video with what I think are the good, the bad, and the in-between with the Murphy Lab guitar. Starting with the good, the weight is very light for a normal Les Paul. I don't have an accurate scale on hand, but I would guess it's in the low 8s. And actually a large number of Murphy Labs I've seen online have been quite light guitars. So good job, Gibson, there. Always nice to have a light Les Paul. The made to measure, it's worth noting, is actually under 8 pounds, and it does not have weight relief. It's shockingly light, but it was a made to measure that was custom ordered, so it's not a fair comparison. Again, very light guitar. In addition, the top on this guitar is just fantastic. It is to die for. I will say that the Murphy Lab tops I've seen for sale online have been pretty lackluster for me. In my opinion, the 60th anniversary Les Pauls had much better tops in general, but there's always exceptions, of course, and I would consider this an exception versus what I've seen from the Murphy Lab. Now, more good is the aging on places like the headstock. I think they nailed it there. The chips they have in the lacquer over the logo just looks great. It's super similar to what I've seen on vintage guitars. You see that happen all the time. I also really like the look of the checking near the switch tip. When it catches the light just right, it looks so cool. In person, it just looks very organic and natural. Partly thanks to just how random it is versus, say, the checking they did on that guitar. Finally, the playability is stellar, as you'd expect from a custom shop Gibson, and the guitar sounds very good, though not quite up to par with the Goldtop in my opinion, but again, you might differ with that. Now for the bad. I mentioned the imbalanced pickups before, but I just think they make the guitar really difficult to use if you like to use all 3 positions. Particularly, I would assume in a live environment, just from my experience with that guitar on the custom buckers. I wish Gibson would make their custom buckers more like their MHS pickups, which in my experience have been very balanced. I actually did a demo of them. If you're curious, I'll put it in the corner and link in the description. But yeah, I preferred MHS over the custom buckers from all the sets I've tried. And again, I've noticed this as a pattern with custom buckers. There's gonna be exceptions out there, but they tend to be, in my experience, really thin in the bridge and quiet versus the neck. Something else I really dislike is the very inconsistent aging for what's supposed to be a heavy age guitar. It's disappointing, honestly, to see the knobs look basically brand new on a guitar that's, aged heavily everywhere else. Compared to my vintage 1963 Les Paul Jr., which also has reflector knobs, albeit black, the Murphys don't look really aged at all. And the little thumb bleeders, pointers here look super shiny. And again, this guitar looks a lot more aged than the 63. And it's not just the knobs either. So the tailpiece and the ABR1 bridge, they're also what I would consider lightly aged. And the thumb wheels look brand spanking new. They're super shiny. So yeah, it's just disappointing. The factory aged hardware on the made to measure actually looks like it'd be a better fit on this guitar. So Gibson can definitely age, hardware heavier. They did on that guitar. So I don't know why they wouldn't, go above and beyond and really age the hardware on the heavy aged Murphy Lab. Going beyond that, the strap button looks basically brand new. It's shiny, looks like a brand new Les Paul's does. And bizarrely, the pickguard bracket here is super rusted. It looks like it was underwater. But then the little flathead here is shiny. And on that guitar, this little thing is aged, and this one doesn't really look to be aged at all. So yeah, just all of the hardware should be more dull than it is, in my opinion. Finally, the last things that I think are bad have to do with the finish or lack thereof. Starting with the neck, the spots of wood where, the finish was removed, Like I said before, it doesn't really bother me, the transition from lacquer to wood. However, there's this very odd bumpy texture on the wood that I didn't notice at first, but then once I did notice it, I couldn't unnotice it, and it became just really distracting and just feels super bizarre while you're playing. I have no idea what that's caused by, if it's isolated to this guitar or, if more guitars have that. So I just thought it was worth mentioning. Very, very odd. The other issue I have with the finish is you can feel the checking actually quite a bit in places. I talked about this a little bit earlier, particularly right here by the strap button and by the horn. Yeah, it's very different from most vintage checking or even the razor blade checking on the made to measure. You can't feel those. This, you can very obviously feel it in parts. Beyond that, there's a topic floating around on forums of a Murphy Lab finish defect issue, which occurs where the checking is particularly raised and kind of looks like cracked glass. Supposedly, on some earlier runs of Murphy Lab Les Pauls, the red cherry finish on the back did not adhere to the guitar wood properly, and that's presumably thanks to the new formula they're using. And the result from that is this rather extreme flaking of the finish, so chunks of the finish just kind of coming right off. That's not supposed to happen. That doesn't happen on vintage guitars. That doesn't happen on modern relics, whether it be Gibson relics or Fender. So that's a defect. This guitar in particular doesn't really appear to have any of this flaking yet, but just kind of based off the look and the feel, I would not be surprised if it develops that same thing in the near future. There are people online that have claimed their dealers told them Gibson is aware of this issue and it's actually been fixed already. So, if you get a newer model, you should be fine. But there's never been an official statement from Gibson, and I honestly doubt there ever will be. There have also been a few owners online that have been able to return their guitars months after owning them because of this issue. So it seems like dealers are at least semi-acknowledging that this is like a defect and an issue, though some have been spotted reselling the return guitars either as new or as demo models with the supposed finish issue still present. I'll pull up an example I saw on Sweetwater, which just kind of shows the finish defect really well. Sweetwater documents it perfectly so you know what you're getting, but I don't know if it's really well known that this is a defect with the finish that could happen a lot more. So just something to be aware of. If you're in the market for a used Murphy Lab or a demo model, you just want to save some money, just be aware of that. It's a potential issue. And it's also worth saying this is a new lacquer formula, so it's largely been untested for long-term durability. It may very well age quicker and more extreme than other finishes, including other relics. Just keep that in mind. You're kind of being a beta tester if you're buying this guitar now. All right, last but not least, let's cover what I consider the in-between or things that are more subjective and can kind of go either way. So price is a really good starting point. This guitar out the door is about $9,000. That is an exorbitant amount of money for a lot of people. If you're one of those people, this guitar, it just frankly isn't made for you. It is what it is. But if you are somebody that can afford this guitar, the question comes up, do you go VOS or do you go with the pedestrian regular custom shop in VOS, or do you step up to the Murphy Lab? So the price difference for the ultralight age, which is the lowest tier, is only about $500, which is not a lot in the grand scheme of things. But going up to heavy age like this, it's an additional $2,500 to $3,000 out the door. So is that worth it? Hard to say. I think that's you're gonna have to make that call. But I do want to say, for me, the perceived worth you get with Murphy Lab, it's a little murky. And that's mainly just because of the method they're now using to age the guitars. So hear me out here. I mentioned before, collector's choice and made to measure, like that guitar, they used to age the guitars with checking by literally, an artist had the guitar on their workbench and they spent presumably hours, with a little razor blade doing intricate little checking marks. The labor involved is just immense to do that. That has perceived value. You can see the man hours behind it. You go, okay, that's why it costs this much. With the Murphy Lab, obviously there's a lot of aging they have to do manually, but it's just not the same as what was required before. So your mileage may vary, but that's just, that's why I consider this an in-between. Another is tone. So I don't think the guitar sounds particularly vintagey to my ears, or at least it doesn't have that great bite and sparkle I associate with a nice burst. You hear the telly on steroids thing. I don't think this guitar has that, but I don't think it sounds bad by any means either. The tone just didn't really win me over into thinking I have to have this guitar. I don't care what the price is. That's just not what I felt. And lastly, the case is really just a perfect example of an in-between. The outside is aged just like the guitar is, And actually the case looks basically identical on the outside to the aged case that came with that guitar. However, the inside is redesigned. It's got more protection and it's like brand new. There's no signs of aging. It's a little goofy to see in person because, you see the case, it looks all worn. You open it up and it's just like shiny, bright pink. The Goldtop case is aged on the inside and it looks super cool in person, but it definitely does not offer the same level of cushion or protection. One thing that's really bizarre that I did notice with the Murphy Lab case, they randomly aged one of the fabric straps on an otherwise shiny new interior of the case. And the other fabric strap is not aged or frayed at all. It's just one. On that guitar, it's both of them. Just very odd. It is worth noting that, whatever you think of the case, if you're going to gig this guitar or a guitar of this level, you're probably going to invest in a better case to transport it in either way. So I don't think it really matters that much. Okay, well guys, that does it. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this honest review helpful and informative. If you did, consider subscribing. I've got plans to do many more of these real gear reviews in the future. I've got a lot of cool guitars, a lot of pretty nice gear. I have friends with really cool guitars and gear. So yeah, there's a lot of videos coming in the future. So stay tuned for that. And lastly, if you feel so inclined, I will be including a link in the comment section where you can actually buy me a coffee if you appreciated the content. Any little bit helps, honestly. These videos take a ton of work to do. So yeah, I appreciate it if you feel so inclined. All right, until next time, I'll see you guys.